The air so close to the planet's central star was thin enough, but it still pulled Joey right off the top of the acid rat. Somehow June had managed to stay on, and hopefully she'd gotten inside before anything went wrong. He'd managed to change the guard's body into something resembling a massive hand and held onto the acid rat's tail for all he could. Even so, he continued to slip further and further down the tail. In all his reading, he'd missed the fact that the ship's power supply was a black hole. That didn't matter now. What did matter was that he was holding tightly to that power supply. Inside the tail must be some type of control mechanism to keep the black hole stable enough to allow the ship to pull power from it. There was no matter-antimatter processing going on here. It was just the massive amount of radiation that powered the ship, and would probably be a nearly endless supply of power. Based on the side of the ship's tail, it wasn't some microscopic black hole. It had to be big. As he slid down the tail, he kept looking for something to get a better hold on, but nothing caught his attention. Not until he saw a small series of bolts. He had to think, just how far back was the ship's power supply? He didn't want to crack open the tail and expose everyone to the power and radiation of a black hole. His heroics would end everything far too quickly. This had to be where he could separate the tail. It just had to be. How was he going to keep hanging on? Not just hanging on, but he needed to somehow remove those bolts, and they were slipping past. He focused to harden the body of the guard and tried to make it more aerodynamic. That kept him from sliding any faster, but he was still moving past. He made the body flow all the way around the tail section. That helped stabilize him better. At least the bolts weren't passing by at this point, where he feared he might pass them. Now he just needed to figure out a way to get them off. Joey focused on hardening the entire guard's body, on one section where the bolts were, and he did his best to imagine them spinning, rotating, turning, moving, anything. If he weren't swimming in jello, then perhaps he might be sweating from exertion. As it was, he couldn't tell if anything were happening. The bolts didn't appear to be moving, but being in the middle of the body made it difficult to see. Wait a minute. Joey swam forward. This gave him a better look at the bolts. Now he could see. He focused even harder on those spots. He could even feel the blob's flesh harden around the bolts. Still, nothing happened. Either the body didn't understand what it was he wanted to do, or it was just plain incapable. He needed a wrench or some other tool. Something made of metal that he'd be able to turn those bolts with. Joey looked at his hand. Sure, it looked like an ordinary hand, but instead of having a new one grown, he thought it would be cooler to have a robotic hand attached. He flexed it a couple of times, unsure if it would work. He had already tried everything else, and now the light from the star dimmed a noticeable amount with each passing minute. There wasn't enough time to wait and hope for another option presenting itself. He swam forward and took hold of the first bolt. The hand gripped it with no trouble. The problem came when he tried to turn it. He didn't have enough strength in his arm. He probably didn't have enough strength in his entire body to turn the bolt. All he could do was hold on to it for all he was worth. Something tugged at his feet. He looked back and didn't see anything. In a moment, his body was extended straight out from the bolt. The blob hardened around him, and suddenly he knew what was about to happen. The blob understood what needed to be done by Joey, thinking about a wrench and unscrewing the bolts. Now it saw Joey as the wrench and began to slowly turn the first bolt. At first, it just hurt and nothing happened, but slowly more pressure was applied and the bolt popped free. Joey was spun in a circle, and around he went until the first bolt came free. To keep the tail section in place until they were ready to completely free it, Joey had the guard plug up the hole, with as much as it could pour into the hole and harden as much as it was able. By the time they'd made it around the tail section, they were just freeing up the last bolt. The tail creaked and groaned and tilted sharply downward. It had gotten so dark, it was difficult to tell which way was up. He shouldn't have looked around. Seeing the ground so far below, after all the spinning he'd just been through, made his head swim. Even closing his eyes didn't help. He felt like he was about to fall away from the ship. In his mind, he envisioned falling, and the guard's body started to slip off the tail section. No! He needed to grip tighter. He needed to stay with the tail section. It needed to get to the star. He understood how the star was powered, why the planet had two poles that opened to draw in material and energy from a brown dwarf it orbited. They didn't draw in much power from their home star. That used about as much power as the acid rat used when it charged up for warp space. Now it made sense why it was so easy for a ship, like the acid rat, to warp space, having the power of a black hole at its disposal. He was getting distracted. He needed to stay focused. He needed to get the tail section to the planet's central star. The tail section broke free. The feeling of weightlessness inside a gel-like fluid was an odd sensation. If he hadn't seen the acid rat getting further and further away, he wouldn't even know anything had happened. Before he could change the shape of the guard's body, he needed to get his bearings. He looked at the ground and followed the curvature around. Everything had gotten so dim, he had to strain just to see the ground. It had all looked so clear just a few moments before. He pointed his left hand at what he thought was the closest point to the planet, below. Then with his other hand extended straight out, he pointed in the exact opposite direction. Looking from fingertip to fingertip, he could see the ground on one side and the darkness on the other. Then he saw it, the faintly glowing shape of the star. Joey thought of wings, massive wings like a butterfly, wings so big that they could lift anything. The body of the guard flowed out and away from the tail section, but Joey made sure not to let it go, did not let it slip away. Bands of the guard's body wrapped around the tail section, and the massive wings beat. At first, nothing happened, but ever so slowly he began to make progress. The star came just a little closer with each beat of the mighty wings. He had to get a better understanding of the central star. He knew it sucked in material and power from the planet's home star, but it must store it somehow. There had to be a process it used to draw power and become a burning source for these people. Pluplupanu, I have a power source for your central star. How can I plug it in? We don't have much time. I'm afraid we are running out of time, Joey Pervosky. Give me a moment to confer with my scientist. Confer? Pluplupanu was supposed to be some kind of godlike being. Why did it need to confer with anyone? Because I cannot hold all the knowledge of each individual in the planet as I once could. Many eons have seen me stretched thin, I'm afraid. Joey Pervosky, the scientists have informed me that if you release the black hole near the central star, they can use what little power is left to force it into an orbit around the central star and draw the power from it they need. Do you think you will be able to perform this task? He didn't have much of a choice, did he? If he didn't release the black hole near the central star, they were all going to die. Vic, June, Argmon, Dexter Bob, even the sheriff and his son, everyone would die. On the other hand, if he did release the black hole, he would be far too close to escape. He'd most likely die in the process of releasing the black hole. He couldn't leave its protective shielding up and release it, or they'd never be able to draw power from it. June, can you hear me? He did his best to focus just on her, but had a feeling that everyone could hear him. It took a moment for her to respond. He could hear her crying, Joey, I'm so sorry. June, if I don't do this, we're all going to die. He didn't know if he was trying to reassure her or himself. I have to do this. Kid, you're a braver man than I. Thanks, Vic. I'm sorry to interrupt. I've got June here with me. Joey, be careful. Maybe you can do this. I already thought this through. I'm sorry, June. I love you. Joey stopped his connection to everyone else. He'd said what he wanted to say. He didn't like that Vic was there to hear it. Somehow he didn't want to die while embarrassed. He had to stop dwelling on a situation. He had to get inside the tail section and figure out how to release the black hole from its confines. He had the body and the butterfly flow forward and into an open end of the tail. Inside, a mass of wires and tubes ran from a large orb in the middle of the tail. The guard would no longer be able to help. Joey stood and leaned forward as the guard pulled itself back and kept the whole of the tail covered. It had gotten close enough to the central star to begin and circle back around. Through Plupunu, the scientists communicated the proper distance they needed to be when they released the black hole. Joey took a deep breath. In the manual, there had been instructions to jettison the black hole should it become unstable. On the floor, in front of the orb, sat a control panel similar to the one in the engineering room. Buttons blinked blue, red, and yellow. He studied them so much, he could do most of the ship's duties with his eyes closed. For this one, he'd have to pay attention, and if he didn't hurry up, he may as well not do anything at all. With his mechanical hand, he punched the wall. He hadn't felt any pain, but nearly all the skin had peeled away from his hand. That must have happened while they were working the bolts off the tail section. He flexed his fingers and frowned. He'd been through so much, and here it ended. He sat on the floor in front of the control panel. There was nothing left to do but start keying in the sequence. No other option was going to present itself. Numbly, he pressed the buttons. Tears streamed down his cheeks.
You've been listening to Hollow, V&A Shipping, Book 2, written and read by J.R. Murdoch. For more information about this production and its author, visit jrmurdoch.com. There are a lot of ways you can choose to spend your time. Thank you for choosing to spend it with me.